As people continue to trickle in, we'd like to welcome you to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health series. This is weekly discussions of practice and science by experts in behavioral health and the law that's hosted by the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, along with the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. I'm Anthony Perillo, the Forensic Psychology Training Director in the Division of Forensic Behavioral Sciences here at the University of New Mexico. For our talk today, if you have any questions for our presenter, make sure you enter them in the Q&A box anytime that you feel comfortable. We do hold the questions until the end, and we try to get to as many as we can, but sometimes it's just not possible to get to all of them. If you are pursuing continuing medical education credits, there will be a sign-in sheet that's posted in the chat shortly, so keep an eye on that. And if you are pursuing APA continuing education credits, make sure you also keep an eye on the chat box. A link will be posted for the CE survey in the latter points of the talk, close to the top of the hour. Make sure you check that link before you exit the survey and before you exit the webinar, excuse me, and make sure that you save your certificate after completing that survey. We don't have access to those completed PDFs of the survey completions after the fact. A recording link and PowerPoint slides should be available sometime later this week for this presentation. And as a heads up for next week's talk in the series, we have Dr. Ashley Battistini, who will be discussing technology use and considerations in both forensic and corrections contexts. But let's come back to this week. I'm very excited for this week's presentation and to introduce you to today's speaker, who'll be discussing the use of social media data when you're conducting a forensic mental health evaluation. This is Dr. Randy Otto. Dr. Randy Otto has been a faculty member in the College of Psychology at Nova Southeastern University since August 2022, previously serving as faculty at the University of South Florida for over 30 years. He's authored and edited a number of books addressing ethics in forensic psychology practice, forensic psychological assessment, expert testimony and report writing, violence risk assessment, and assessment of criminal competencies. He's the current executive director of the American Board of Forensic Psychology, and he's received numerous awards for his contributions to professional psychology, including from the University of Nebraska, the New York State Psychological Association, the American Psychology Law Society, the American Academy of Forensic Psychology, and the American Board of Professional Psychology. Dr. Otto, Randy, on behalf of the University of New Mexico, it's an honor to have you joining our series, and we're very thankful for you sharing your expertise on a continuing, emerging, important topic of conversation for all of us. I'll go ahead and throw it over to you.
Thanks so much. I'm happy to be here and participate. I've enjoyed these seminars, certainly as a consumer, and have been on many of these programs on the other side of the camera, and really appreciate the effort that you and your department are making for forensic psychiatry, forensic psychology, and related professions with interest in the forensic arena generally, and glad that I can make a contribution in this way. In terms of what we're going to talk about today, I'll briefly cover the agenda. We'll take care of some obligatory items. I'll make some preliminary comments, cover some basics about the ubiquity of social media and how it's used today, talk about the potential value that social media can have when it comes to forensic psychological and psychiatric evaluations of litigants, talk about some related concerns, and then finally leave you with some considerations that might guide you through how you will contemplate whether you want to use social media data, whether you want to search for social media data, and ultimately, if and when you get it, how you might use it to ensure that you do so in as fair and equitable and appropriate way as possible. With respect to the housekeeping, I'm obligated to share that I don't have any financial arrangements related to the content of this activity. I won't be making reference to anything in which I have a financial interest or anything like that. Then obviously anything I do say are my own views, my own perspectives, my own opinions, and do not necessarily represent the views, policies, or positions of the University of New Mexico or its affiliate departments. Just so you can see this visually, Dr. Perillo sort of addressed this earlier. There is a process for getting continuing education credit for this program. And at the very end, you'll have a slide in front of you that sort of lets you know where you need to go in order to get to the evaluation that'll in turn make you eligible for the certificate of attendance or completion. I really do encourage you to take advantage of discussion and questions by way of the chat function. And as was indicated earlier, I'll take those questions and we can talk about these matters towards the end of our hour together today. And we might even bleed a little over into the next hour. So let's, with that being said, let's sort of get into the meat of all this. The ubiquity of social media data today. So this is something that I picked up off the internet, and you'll see here that I have dated when I pulled this, and it was 2022. And one thing I always think is important to keep in mind whenever we're talking about technology, so important is to consider the date that something was published, the date that these data were collected and presented, because it's just changing so quickly. And if I were to search for and come up with a more up-to-date graphic here, it might be a very different picture, but if this is in billions, right? Billions of active users. And obviously some of these platforms or networks are better known and some are lesser known. A number of these are sort of remain unknown to me as a function of who I am and how I spend my time, but I'm sure everyone in this program can identify at least some of these sites. And I'm sure many of the people who are attending this program today use these sites. For what it's worth, I got on Google yesterday and tried to get an estimate of the world's population, and it came in at something over 8 billion. So if you look at, these are not obviously independent users. Someone can be active on Facebook and YouTube and WhatsApp and Instagram. And it seems like there are some people very much like that. But in any case, you can see that there's a whole bunch of people using social media data. So it may well be a rich data source when it comes to a number of things, including forensic, psychological, and psychiatric evaluation. Here's another graphic for you, and you can kind of get to the source of this graphic yourself. But this is a little more focused on the United States, where I assume most of you are joining from today. But these data are compelling, right? No matter what the platform, Facebook, YouTube, Snapchat, look at the percentage of adults who are estimated to be taking advantage of some of these sites and presumably in some cases sharing information by way of these sites. So more and more, we might think that it will be the exception where we evaluate someone who hasn't been involved in social media in some way and maybe posted or made contributions to social media rather than it being the other way around. So use of social media data in the world in the United States is ubiquitous. It may be a rich data source. Well, how could it be rich? What value might it be? Well, it could have the potential of corroborating data that we gather from other sources. accounts offered by the person during the context of the interview, during the course of the forensic, psychological, or psychiatric interview. Data that are provided by collateral informants, data that are included in records that are provided as collateral data sources. So it could be consistent with or inconsistent with other sources of data. And we might come to think about it as just another data source. But I don't think we're thinking about it today that way in current times, just because of its newness and all of that. In addition to being consistent with or inconsistent with data we gather from other sources, might we see subtle or indirect indicators of functioning and activity in terms of cognitive functioning, behavioral functioning, emotional functioning? And I even have here possibly values, and I've identified value. I've enclosed values in parentheses because I think that if we're going to try to draw opinions about people's values, first of all, there's a lot of forensic, psychological, and psychiatric evaluations where we're not particularly interested in people's values. And secondly, as I've thought about it, it's probably going to require considerably more inference to look at social media data and draw inferences about values than maybe inferences about cognitive, behavioral, or emotional functioning. Imagine, for example, you have a case of a person who's charged with a heinous crime, and the person went to the lengths to broadcast that crime on Facebook or something like that. In fact, there are such cases that we know of that have been brought to our attention by way of the press. Might give you insight into things like intentionality, the quality of their cognitive function. What if someone's posting to YouTube videos that might give you insight into their cognitive, behavioral, emotional functioning at a time that is adjacent to or particularly close in time to the time of interest when we're trying to draw conclusions about their mental state specifically, whether it's the time of an offense or prior to or after some kind of injury or accident or claim wrongdoing by a third party defendant in a civil suit or something like that. And so I think the potential value here lies in both criminal and civil litigation, personal injury matters. I gave you as an example someone who posted shortly prior to or after an alleged assault or alleged wrongdoing of another party. What kind of insight does that give us into their functioning? Disability matters, where people are sharing their functioning. Maybe when at the same time they're claiming a disability, and their disability claims, maybe their disability claims appear to be inconsistent with their presentation and functioning by way of the frequency of their social media posts, the content of their social media posts, their behavior during social media posted events, etc. Testamentary capacity, to the degree that we're trying to form opinions about someone's emotional, behavioral, and cognitive functioning at and around the time they executed a will there be cases where there are social media data that give us some insight into that person's functioning? Child custody, another kind of civil matter where we might get insight into someone's behaviors. I would say that if I were to identify a forensic, psychological, or psychiatric evaluation where matters of values are more likely to rear their heads, it might well be matters of child custody. What do these social media posts, how might they give us insight? Competence to proceed, mental state at the time of the offense, sentencing as well. I'm reminded of the first time I ever considered social media data. It was a sentencing evaluation of a man. Well, at the time I evaluated him, he was a man. In the weeks before his 18th birthday, he killed both his parents. There was no death penalty on the table, obviously, as he was not a legal adult. So he killed both his parents literally weeks before he turned 18, and proceeded to have a party in his parents' home with them sort of secluded, their bodies secluded in one of the back bedrooms. It was established that prior to the murder, after the murder, he advertised he was going to have a big house party to his peers by way of Facebook. He advertised that. And then there were a number of posts after the murders as well. These Facebook posts were gathered by the prosecution and provided to me as I was conducting an evaluation in anticipation of sentencing. I had another case, that was the first case in which I ever considered or was provided social media data. I would estimate now that case is probably about 15 years old at this point. I had a recent case where the issue was the defendant's competence to proceed. And part of that was any kind of risk that the defendant might have presented to the community, and made available to me were a number of social media posts made by the defendant where he appeared to have access to weapons and was engaged in some very sort of threatening and inflammatory behaviors. And there may well be other contexts as well, other kinds of evaluations where you see these kinds of data. Now, what I will say is, with the rise of use of social media, we shouldn't be surprised that we see an increased discussion and consideration of it in litigation. And obviously, as forensic psychologists and forensic psychiatrists were involved in litigation. I'm going to present you in a second here with the results of a survey of some appellate cases in federal and state courts that was conducted in 2020. Again, I want to underline this study, this publication is 4 years old now, and it describes cases that were reported between 2007 and 2017. 2007, of course, is 17 years ago. 2017, 7 years ago. And I think if you sort of replicated this study and this approach, you'd see a very different thing. But the investigators reported that between 2007 and 2017, they observed a 350% increase in appellate cases where there was some kind of reference to social media data. And this was in the US Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And then in a sampling of appellate cases in California, a 3,000% increase in the number of references in these appellate cases to some reference to social media data. And so here you can see these are the state court cases over time, broken out as a function of the kind of case it was, whether it was criminal or civil. If it was civil, whether it was family law or something else, et cetera. So you can just see this sort of incredible rise about how some social media somehow was being discussed in the context of some kind of state litigation in California. And again, I think we would see numbers very different if we took a look today, at least seven years later. These are the data for the federal appellate cases, and a similar, although maybe not as dramatic a rise in terms of frequency with which social media data were indicated. It's obviously a smaller number, but still a meaningful rise nonetheless. So that social media data is not being used and considered and argued about in current litigation is sort of a naive assumption. Well, let's talk a little bit about what mental health professionals are doing, particularly mental health professionals when conducting forensic psychiatric and psychological evaluations when it comes to using social media data. Here's the results of a very modest study, I would say. Again, I report to you the data publication, which is 2018 at this point, 6 years old. So we're probably, we're describing conduct and reports and approaches. They're at least 6 years, if not maybe 7 years old. And I say this is a modest study, but it's, the best I was able to come across. This is what I call a convenience survey of 102 mental health professionals who were accessed by way of a combination of listservs, membership, e-lists, email contacts lists, and personal contacts. So not to be considered representative of forensic practice generally, but nonetheless, you look at what you can look at and remain cautious about its meaning. The overwhelming majority of the 100+ respondents were psychologists, and then you can see that they were sort of middle-aged and I would say at this point in my career, relatively less experienced. Average was 10 years of experience. So we presumably had a fair number of people with less than 10 years of experience, forensic experience, and people with more as well. And then we see that of those people who responded to this survey that happened to find its way into their electronic inbox, approaching 2/3 of them acknowledged using social media data in some way when conducting a forensic evaluation, and fewer reported actually calling social media sites themselves to gather the data, and a greater proportion indicated that they had relied on data that was collected presumably by one of the parties and provided to them. So that's something we'll talk about a little later is if you do think social media data have the potential for value, how are social media data collected in what way? Provided by the plaintiff, provided by the defendant, provided by the prosecution, independently sought out by you, or that's something that's probably fruitful for further discussion. What kinds of evaluations are the professionals looking to social media data? And what I've sort of separated it out into here is types of evaluations and sort of two broad categories. One is criminal forensic evaluation, and the second is civil forensic evaluation. So this what percentage of professionals who engage in these evaluations, what percentage of them report using data in that type of evaluation. And you can see that in the criminal realm, at least, of those respondents who reported engaging or conducting risk or threat assessments, about half of them reported using it in that context. A somewhat smaller percentage of respondents reporting using it, of those respondents who were assessing mental state at the time of the offense, a smaller percentage, 39%, reported using social media data, and then an even smaller percentage reporting reliance on it in the context of competence to stand trial evaluation. A smaller proportion of the respondents in this convenience sampling survey reported engagement in civil forensic work. I think that's sort of pretty much par for the course when we look at how forensic psychologists and forensic psychiatrists spend their time. And of those who reported engaging, conducting child custody or parenting work, approaching 2/3 reporting relying on the social media data. A smaller percentage who did personal injury work, relying on social media data, and then an even smaller percentage who did disability work of some type. That's distinguished from personal injury, presumably on the behalf of insurers or attorneys representing insured persons. This I found a very interesting query of the 100+ respondents, which is, here's a whole list of collateral data sources, something other than what the litigant shares with you, or maybe results of testing that go towards giving us some insight into the litigant's emotional, behavioral, and cognitive function. Rate the value of these sources of data. I'm sorry, including the examining self-report, because that would include the forensic interview. Rate them in terms of how helpful they are. 1 is most helpful and 11 is least helpful. And then obviously they meaned those responses for the various data sources. So hospital or medical records were rated as having the most value, police reports, second most value, examining self-reports. And you can see, we can go down the list. I don't need to read them one by one. And then you get to the 3 lowest rated collateral data sources in terms of value. Attorneys, social media data coming in right above jailhouse snitches, which I thought was an interesting finding. And also an interesting finding is jailhouse snitches don't come in much different than attorneys. That's another interesting finding of this survey. But although examiners may use it, they're pretty cautious in terms of what value they think it may have, at least when compared to these other collateral sources of data. And again, I don't want to overstate the significance of, what is probably the first survey of mental health professionals with respect to their practices and what they see, practices regarding social media data use and the value they consider it to have. Well, as I was thinking about this, and I've been thinking about this for a few years now, and at one point I wrote an article with a couple co-authors on this matter, including Gianni Pirelli. I was just trying to sort of make sense about social media data conceptually. And one of the things I did was I started thinking about it as compared to other data that we all rely on. Okay, here's this new, technology-based social source of data, collateral data. It's new because it's based in a burgeoning technology. Well, what does and what doesn't it have in common with other data sources that we rely on when we conduct forensic psychological or psychiatric evaluations? And so what I did was I put together a list of different kinds of collateral data sources we might use and concerns we might have about these various data sources. And I'll get to that in a minute. The one thing I want to say is there's no professional guideline. There's no professional guidelines regarding how to use social media data in forensic evaluation context. They're using social media data in forensic mental health evaluation is not addressed at all in the specialty guidelines for forensic psychology, which I think is probably the most comprehensive guideline for forensic psychology practice. There's no discussion of social media use in the ethical guidelines for the practice of forensic psychiatry that are published by the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law. There's 2 or 3 sentences about the potential value of social media data. There's 2 or 3 sentences addressing the potential value of social media data that are included in Apple's more general forensic assessment guidelines, not their ethical guidelines, but many of you know that Apple has maybe published 8 guidelines relevant to forensic psychiatric evaluation, and there's sort of a freestanding forensic psychiatric assessment guideline where there's 2 or 3 sentences there. Now, that being said, there's a number of organizations that provide some commentary on using social media in mental health practice, but almost all of that is relevant to therapists, right? Using social media data or accessing social media when you're involved and working with someone therapeutically. And I think it's a fair observation or a fair conclusion that given the meaningful differences between the duties that attach and the obligations that apply to forensic psychological and psychiatric evaluation and how they differ from when psychiatrists and psychologists are working with people therapeutically, I don't see the various documents or guidelines that have been published with respect to accessing, relying, and using social media data when working with people therapeutically provide much guidance. In terms of professionals' concerns about using social media data in forensic evaluation contexts, I think there's going to be a number of them. It's going to be matters of informed consent. So if you're going to look at postings that an examinee has made to Facebook or YouTube videos the person has posted or other kinds of social media data sources, how do we think about informed consent? I think it's probably, well, I'll say this. I assume that people I'm examining don't think that they don't assume that I'm going to look for that kind of stuff. And they might not assume, unless notified by an attorney, they might not assume that it will be the subject of attention. That might be an assumption that's worthy of consideration and investigation. So matters of informed consent. Matters of privacy, you know, is it if social media data are accessed, is it somehow an invasion of someone's privacy? We'll talk more about that later. Particularly if the examiner goes about himself or herself gathering the data, right? I didn't get it from the prosecutor. I didn't get it from the defense attorney, but rather I went out there and found that the defendant I'm evaluating has an open, accessible Facebook page or a Snapchat account or something like that. Is that turning me into an investigator and something different than a forensic psychologist or forensic psychiatrist? There's probably going to be concerns expressed about the authenticity of the data. Well, it says that it's Joe Blow's Facebook page, but is it Joe Blow's Facebook page? Are all of those posts his posts? Could someone somehow get into his Facebook page and post commentary or content that is not his in an attempt to make him look bad? In fact, there was a case a few years ago in the course of divorce where it was determined that one of the spouses had gained access to the soon-to-be ex-spouse's social media account and had been falsely loading commentary on it in order to put the soon-to-be ex-spouse in a negative light. Questions about the value of social media data because of the potential for impression management or bias of the speaker. And then possibly, well, in worst case scenario, if there are some of these problems, does that mean that if I access, if I use, if I consider the data and form opinions based on the data, might that render my opinions inadmissible? So these might be some of the concerns that you are that are running through your head as we talk about this this approach. So sort of getting back to what I was referencing earlier is on the horizontal here, as I was thinking about and trying to make sense of this, I posted various kinds of collateral data, the data we're talking about today, highlighted in red, and then other kinds of collateral data, email, communications, texts, voicemails, diaries or journals, interviews of collaterals or depositions of collaterals, healthcare records, secretive audio or video recordings, as distinguished from a voicemail, for example. That's presumably not a secretive recording. The person presumably knows they're leaving a voicemail. And then on the left hand, on the vertical, what I have is maybe some of these concerns, authenticity of data. Well, like I said, you might be thinking, well, how do we know that it was Joe Blow, the plaintiff, who actually posted this picture or posted these commentaries or whatever else? So that's a reason to be concerned. My take on this, and as I try to make sense of this, I don't think questions about authenticity of data are unique to social media data as collateral data source. You could say the same thing when it comes to emails or texts or voicemails or diaries or journals or secretive audio or video recordings. Well, what about impression management? So people maybe suspect or anticipate that their social media data will be considered in litigation, so they make an explicit effort to present a certain kind of facade, presenting them in a really good light, maybe a really negative light. So again, I think we have to be concerned about that, but I think we might be concerned about that at least with respect to some emails, texts, and voicemails, depending on when in time they occur. I would say same thing with respect to social media data. You know, when were the data logged? When were they reported? Prior to the litigation, after the litigation? Same thing with email, text, or voicemails. Same thing with diaries or journals, collateral interviews or depositions, healthcare records, secretive audio or video recordings. If someone wants to post to social media sites as they're terribly impaired and their life's a mess ever since the sexual harassment in the workplace, and they're experiencing a variety of problems, so too can they report that to their healthcare professional in an attempt to come off in a certain way. Privacy intrusions, I get that, but again, I think you can express concerns about privacy and when it comes to reviewing or considering data from all these other data sources. The examiner becomes an investigator in some kind of inappropriate way. I get that, at least if the examiner himself or herself is trying to access the data as distinguished from it being provided to him or her. But you can say the same thing about other data sources to the degree that the examiner says, I can't access the emails, but I certainly would like them. What's the difference between saying that or saying to an attorney, I'd like to see social media data, or maybe even going out and getting it yourself, although I do acknowledge there's a distinction there. And then is it possible that if we use social media data, that there could be some ruling that opinions based in full or in part on it are inadmissible? And we certainly wouldn't want that to occur, but you may run the risk of that when it comes to considering other kinds of collateral data, maybe less so, but certainly that could be the case. So they may be more like gooses and less like gooses and ganders, to get back to all of that. Some potential legal hurdles and concerns offered by a non-attorney, like I said, matters of privacy. And what is the nature of the information, and is it protected in some way? Many people in this program are more knowledgeable than me about protections that can be used to kind of close or block access to data versus sort of public facing platforms. And are we going to treat those kinds of things differently? Matters of authenticity and authentication, but that is really a concern that pre-exists potential use of social media data. Matters of relevance and impact, I get that. And like I said, I think that some, if not all of these concerns apply across the board whenever we consider various collateral data sources in forensic, psychological, and psychiatric forensic evaluation. So some recommendations for contemplating the use of social media data. I think, in my opinion, social media data have more in common with other collateral data sources than they are different. That's my take. And maybe as a result, maybe the default should be we treat social media data in a similar way, maybe with some exceptions in some contexts. Obviously, if there might be some rule or law in your jurisdiction prohibiting the practice, you would obviously not want to rely on it. I'm not aware of any jurisdictions where there is such a prohibition or there are limitations. I'd love for anyone participating in this training today who can cite such examples. I'd love to hear them. But you can only know so many jurisdictions, and pretty much my knowledge is limited to the jurisdiction which I practice, which is the state of Florida. I think if we're going to use social media data, we want to put all who are involved on alert about its potential use and give the parties the opportunity to object, right? And if there is some objection, let the attorneys or the judge decide it. And if the attorneys can't reach an agreement, they can take it in front of the judge. In many cases, we don't have to access social media data immediately. And one of my favorite sort of cautions when we as forensic mental health professionals are trying to figure out the right path, when the right path is not obvious, is prudence, right? Why jump the gun and why do something maybe without getting the input of others with an interest in the matter? I think it's probably important, as I was suggesting above, to distinguish between protected data and unprotected data. Like I was saying earlier, some platforms allow for various degrees of security or privacy. And that might have implications with respect to the data that is reasonable for us to access, the data it's reasonable for us to be provided, the data it's reasonable for us to consider. Consider how the data will be collected and accessed. I would say least controversial will be considering social media data provided by attorneys. As an examiner, I think it's reasonable for you to consider collateral data that are provided by the parties. And if one of the parties presents it to you, you may well consider it. Now, that doesn't mean that you could not get collateral data that one of the two parties is going to object to. You should have never seen that data. It should have never been provided for whatever arguments they want to make or reasons they want to provide. So if you were concerned about that, even when provided with social media data, you could say to the attorney, is the other counsel aware of this? Is there a potential for an objection? And rely on the counsel's representation. If you're not confident doing that, you could contact the other counsel. I've been provided with a whole list of postings that opposing counsel is suggesting were made by your client on her Facebook page in the hours prior to and after the murder. What do you have to say about that? Probably more controversial, maybe considering social media data provided by examinees, and maybe most controversial, maybe considering social media data that you've searched for and collected yourself. And then it might well be left to you to come to some conclusion about what you're most comfortable with and what you're most comfortable doing. I think when we are looking at these social media data, we have to be concerned and be thinking about issues like impression management. I would say we should always be concerned about impression management issues and response style in the course of forensic evaluation, and make sure if we are going to get the data that we get all the relevant data. And here's sort of, I found this online. I thought this was an interesting post. You know, if you look at the Instagram post, oh my gosh, this woman's just in a beautiful setting. But if you look at the if you look at the unedited or the uncropped picture, you see she's on the top of, I don't know if it's a water tower there or the roof of a building or something like that. We got some indications of this, and we've known this for a long time. Phaedrus, we get from Phaedrus, things are not always as they seem. And one of our current day philosophers, Kim Kardashian, herself has made reference to the Instagram effect and how what we see on Instagram may not reflect anything close to reality. And if anyone would know, it'd probably be Kim Kardashian. I think we have to provide the alleged poster the opportunity to explain, as I think we would do, or as I would certainly recommend when it comes to any collateral data sources. Well, you tell me X, these posts that I believe you made, and if you didn't make them, I'm happy to hear that, but these posts say Y and help me understand, okay? Remember that the impression management issue, right? People may appear different on social media than they may in real life. And I grabbed this off the internet. This is Rami Malek, I think is his name. He's an actor. On the left, here's a picture of him playing Freddie Mercury in the Queen biopic. And then here's a picture of him. I don't know where they got that, if that's in real life or that's him in another movie, but you can clearly see differences here. But I think the pictures and the commentary make the point. Consider the date of the posting as it's related to the litigation. Literally, was the posting in the hours before the offense or the days after the sexual assault? Or was it 12 months before the offense or 12 months after the alleged sexual assault? And this, I got this, I grabbed this off the internet. And this is the webpage of a family law attorney, Rebecca Palmer, her firm. And she has a page and she has a video on how divorcing parents should and shouldn't use social media, right? So so again, we have to keep that in mind. You can actually find people commenting on what you should and shouldn't do when it comes to social media during the divorce process. And I'm sure we could all among us come up with a list of things that parents who are litigating custody and parenting time and access to children should do, and what they shouldn't do. And that the date of the posting may be relevant. If you're being provided data, only accept and consider data that you can maintain, right? We have a general responsibility to make available data upon which we rely. So if we are provided with data, maybe electronically, we want to make sure that it's data that we can somehow memorialize. If it's a web page that goes down or something that gets erased. I've actually been involved in a case like that, where there were some very meaningful posts, pictures, and then they were deleted. Now, could they have been ultimately obtained somehow? I don't know. But I was happy that I had captured the social media data that was meaningful to me, even though subsequently they had been taken down. Obviously, consider the relevance and the probative value of the data. That applies to all collateral data. That's collateral data 101. If the context or the interpretation of the data are contested, consider offering a conditional opinion. If these posts are genuinely that of the plaintiff, then this. If he didn't post them, then it presents a very different picture, obviously. And then obviously, again, this is a forensic practice 101. We're always going to make explicit reference to any data source we consider and rely upon in probably a section of our report titled sources of data. And then to the degree that we use it and we use it in our reasoning, maybe explicit discussion in the report itself, citing the data, the posting, the picture, what sense we're making of it, how we're interpreting it, and the meaning of that, probably associated with the discussion of how the alleged poster comes to explain it or make sense of it. Okay. This is a nice summary that I pulled from a chapter offered by Ashley Battistini, who, by the way, is next week's speaker, who's going to be talking about using technology in forensic and correctional practice. But Ashley Battistini and Mike Vitacco a few years ago edited a book on use of technology in forensic mental health evaluation. And in one of the chapters, they listed these, the way social media data should be discussed in the report itself. And these are sort of self-explanatory, I believe. And again, I think are just as much an indication of good forensic evaluation practice generally, and not necessarily, most of these are not necessarily specific to considering social media data specifically. And then I provided for you a number of references that I've cited in this lecture and program. Some of these references that I provide to you were not included, or I did not make reference to them in the body of my presentation, but I thought some of you might be interested in them anyway. At the top of the page here is that article that I referenced that I wrote a few years ago with Gianni Pirelli and a couple of his colleagues on thinking about and using internet and social media data. And then finally, this is your evaluation link and QR code. So you can give New Mexico and me a little feedback about today's 55 minutes. And also get your hands on that oh so valuable evaluation form. Certificate of completion. So with that all being said, I will stop sharing and turn it over to our moderator.
Thank you so much, Dr. Otto, for such a thorough and approachable discussion of an issue that can sometimes feel daunting for people that perhaps have not considered or actively done this. But in a way, we have the skills when we think about all the collateral data sources that we're using, and using those kind of mindsets and approaches and seeing how much of that can map on to use of social media in our reports here. We have a number of questions here already. Feel free, if you have any more, to enter them into the Q&A box. The CEU links should be available there in the chat. They do seem to be working. If you do have any issues, let us know. We'll do our best to correct that. But this should be up and running, and check the chat box for that. Somebody asked, and several of these questions, it seemed like you almost you anticipated the question and answered them maybe like 2 or 3 minutes after they asked them. I might go back to some of those anyway if there's additional info to discuss. Somebody near the end asked if there were a good set of questions for collateral sources that provide social media info to help improve the validity of that info. And they said, for example, their agency often gets postings from a local school district.
So can you repeat the question?
Are there a good set of questions for collateral sources that provide social media info to help improve the validity of that info that you do receive?
I think it's a great question. I haven't thought about it. I wish I had, and I wish I had, so my first thought is this, do you represent this as a complete posting? Or is this a posting of what you consider the times to be relevant or the relevant post? One of the things I pointed out was make sure it is representative and relevant. And particularly when it comes to some social media platforms, if the data are being provided to you by a third party, I guess that's how I'm considering that collateral contact reference there. You want to make sure that it's all the relevant data and not just what they consider to be relevant. So questions about, well, what do I have? Do I have every Facebook post dating back to January of 2022? Or did you cherry pick the ones that you think are relevant? Or did you just give me the posts that beginning the week before the offense and ending the week after? So that'd be one question I think you certainly want to take care of when you're being provided social media data by the attorney or the plaintiff herself examining the defendant himself, the criminal defendant.
Jumping off of that idea of what is relevant and the time frame, somebody asked, since social media can be just a moment in a person's overall life, should evaluators get into reviewing all of a person's social media history to get into patterns in their posting to then determine its usefulness?
That's a good question. And again, I think there's a parallel for this. How much history do you gather from someone? Right. I mean, I see cases where people spend 25 hours conducting a forensic interview, and they go into such great detail where I wouldn't go into that great detail if I was conducting the evaluation. And they have a different, apparently a different belief as to what is potentially relevant and what means thorough and comprehensive than I do. They would probably look at my interviews and my reports and describe me as those people would describe me as incredibly lacking comprehensiveness and thoroughness. So I think that's going to be a decision that you have to make as the examiner as to how much do I need to look at. Right? You could maybe get some guidance from the person who made the post, right? I strongly recommend that you always discuss the data with the poster. And if he wants to say, well, this was just, something bizarre. I've never contemplated violence. I've never thought about violence in my whole life. It was just a accumulation of events that led me to that post that I sincerely regret that I would blow up the school or something like that. Okay, well, maybe I'll do a deeper dive in response to that explanation. But I don't know if we can come up with a hard and fast rule. And I don't necessarily think the person asking the question is asking for such. That's my
certainly, and thank you for that. Somebody asked about your thoughts on social media data in terms of pure content versus persons' follow lists or likes that they show interests in through social media. Do you find that to be potentially useful social media data?
I have to say I haven't gone down that route, but that's a very good point. I have a lot to learn myself, and I have a lot to think about, and that's why I enjoy giving presentations like this and getting feedback and others' perspectives, because I certainly don't have all the answers, and that's something for me to think about. But a very good observation, a very good point.
Wonderful. Yes. Would you consider collateral provided by a family member of similar risk and quality as that provided by an attorney or by the person you're evaluating themselves?
Can you repeat the question?
Would you consider if that collateral social media data was provided by a family member to be of a similar risk in terms of the quality or validity of it as that info if it were provided by the attorney or by the patient themselves?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to start by saying, I don't think it's that different from whether a collateral family member, let's say it's a custody matter, and you're going to interview mom and dad who are arguing about where the kid should live and where they should spend time and who should make important life decisions for them. You interview mom and dad, and maybe you interview dad's sister who lives in town and is a frequent babysitter. No social media data. All right, well, how are we going to consider dad's sister? We're going to assume that dad's sister is on dad's side, right? Maybe dad's sister thinks that mom is an excellent parent and her brother's a little negligent. So we struggle with those questions whenever we have collateral informants, right? And now you're saying, well, what if a collateral informant is providing social media data? Well, what do we know? What do we know about that collateral informant and their involvement with the litigant or the litigants, right? Bill Austin, a psychologist who for a long time was at University of Virginia and then relocated out to Colorado. Bill might be retired at this point, but he published a couple articles specific to his area of interest, which was value of collateral informants in child custody matters. And what he offered this this challenge of typically people who are more involved with the litigants, mom and dad, have more valuable information, right? The school teacher or the baseball coach typically doesn't have as much valuable information as the aunt, maybe sometime. But then that's sort of compounded by, well, what are their allegiances? And he does a very nice job of sort of giving us some suggestions for how we kind of balance this. What's the relationship between the collateral and the person about whom we're trying to form expert opinions, and how do we treat the information they give us? So I would say it's no different than what we struggle with whenever we're talking to collaterals about their own opinions or observations or whatever else.
I mean, that does certainly seem to be a core theme here, is that when it comes down to this, a lot of this info is no different.
More similarities than differences. That's
Wonderful.
the conclusion I came to. And, you know, if people see it differently, I'd really be interested in hearing the circumstances where it may be different. And I'm not saying that it's 100% similar and there's easy answers all the time, but I think there's a lot of similarities, more similarities than differences.
Absolutely. One final kind of adjacent question that someone asked at the end. Any opinions about looking at websites, social media of other expert witnesses in a forensic case to provide that info to an attorney for cross-examination?
It's a good question. I like the question. I was just actually on another expert's website before we started this program. Not that I'm involved in any litigation. I was curious about this expert's sort of history generally. But my first response to that is role. You know, how are we involved in the matter? I wouldn't want to be seen as gathering information about experts in a way that could raise questions about my objectivity and independence and impartiality if another role was inconsistent with that, maybe examiner or something like that. Forensic psychiatry and forensic psychology, I believe, continues to go round and round, chase our tails on this issue of multiple roles and relationships in forensic context. Is it okay to treat and examine? Is it okay to treat a person and examine them? Multiple role, multiple relationships. Is it okay to conduct an examination and then work with the attorney that retains you to foster cross-examination of the other expert, or, you know, give them access to the webpage and identify a bunch of concerns you have, or what? We continue to chase our tail around this issue. Everyone, first of all, there's some basics. One, there's no absolute prohibition against multiple roles or relationships. No profession, no discipline uniformly prohibits multiple roles, multiple relationships. They all come up with something like, multiple roles or multiple relationships that impair objectivity or efficacy or risk harm to someone to whom you owe a duty. So I certainly think that important and valuable information about experts can be gathered from their websites. Absolutely. It's there presenting themselves to the public. Got no problem with anyone who wants to look for that. But the other part of the question is more perplexing and complicated for me. And that is, and when is it appropriate for the psychologist or psychiatrist to provide assistance to counsel with respect to accessing, making sense of, and understanding?
Well, if Jeff Youngren was still online, I'm sure he'd be applauding in the discussion of multiple relationships not being inherently problematic and looking at how it actually impacts your objectivity and your role as an examiner. Thank you so much, Dr. Otto, for a very helpful discussion. And like I said, again, I come back to the word approachable when I think about making some things that can seem daunting if we haven't done it before, far less scary and in the mindset of the same kind of decisions and principles that we do have as forensic evaluators.
Well, thanks so much. Like I said, I've been I've benefited greatly from the university's program, and it's I always enjoy the opportunity to make my own contribution in return.
Love it. Absolutely. We'll love to have you back here in New Mexico at some point. Yeah.
Okay, take care.
That wraps up this week's Law and Mental Health series. We hope to see you next week with Ashley Battistini talking about technology issues in forensic and corrections contexts. Until then, have a fantastic rest of your week.